Welcome to another episode of The Pity Party. This is our third podcast. We are three Muslim Canadian women with disabilities living in the Greater Toronto area, coming from different lands and cultures, with a combined experience of over 150 years to share with you today. I'm Rabia and I'm blind.
I'm Rafia and I'm in a wheelchair.
I'm Omaya and I am in a wheelchair too.
So today we are going to we always talk about what's happening around us, what those headline issues are. And one of those headline issues that should be a headline 365 days of the year is truth and reconciliation. And that is, recommendations made in a report in consultation with our Indigenous, First Nations, and Métis communities about how we can acknowledge the past and move on toward a better future. So, Canada was occupied by European forces. It is a settler country, and we are settlers in this land. Turtle Island was the original homeland of various Indigenous peoples. And being based out of Mississauga, the Greater Toronto region, these regions were most recently the traditional homelands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So, truth and reconciliation. Well, Canada finally, the federal government finally declared September 30th, 2021 as a national holiday. Unfortunately, most of our provinces or any of our provinces haven't necessarily done the same. Actually, I'm not up on my provinces, so I'm actually not sure. But here in Ontario, we certainly did not adopt it as a holiday. It's not a holiday to so-called celebrate. It's a holiday to reflect, to think about what happened in the past, the wrongs that were done, and commit to making the future right. So people with disabilities were also wronged historically. We were institutionalized, but we were given rights through our human rights codes, through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we've moved on to accessibility legislations in provinces and federally. However, our government continued to fight any compensation for residential school survivors. Residential schools were where children from Indigenous communities were taken and forced to live, to strip them of their identity, their language, their beliefs, their culture, their way of knowing and being. People with disabilities were put in residences as well, in residential schools. But we shut down those schools and we shut down those institutions. We continue to have Indigenous people living on reserves, and in some cases without safe housing, without clean drinking water, third world conditions in a first world nation. We as people with disabilities coming from newcomer communities have had very little interaction with Indigenous people. We've just recently started to learn more and more about them. And we want to know more. We want to know more about our brothers and sisters from Indigenous communities. We care about what happens to people around the world, Indigenous people in other lands around the world, especially if they're Muslim. And yet we ignore the realities in our own backyard of our Indigenous sisters and brothers. So ladies, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, what do you know about our Indigenous neighbors?
Rabia, for me, first of all, it's very important for us, for me as an immigrant woman, as a Muslim woman, as a non-indigenous person, to for this day to educate ourselves on the issues and acknowledge that it is a very, very painful past and a lot of trauma for those who experience this, the Aboriginal community. And it's something that we don't know. We ourselves as immigrant women, as Muslim women, we don't have as many interaction with the Aboriginal community as much, right? But the one of the parallels that we can bring is the whole issue of the institutionalization, as you mentioned, of people with disability, and that's been a really painful past in our history in the disability community. Grave injustices have been done, and that's where we need to advocate for these systemic issues facing the Aboriginal community, and that this whole oppression against people is where we come in solidarity with the community.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you, Rafia. Like, as an immigrant woman with disabilities, I can really relate, because all the fight is to have an identity. Like, first, like, to be, my fight and our fight is to be recognized as like human beings, right? And also like as women. And then I can never imagine, like, I don't know much about indigenous people. Like, I only learned whatever the media volunteer, right, about the information. I didn't have a chance to have like a first-hand experience. But I'm ready to learn, and I'm ready to educate myself, right, and my family. And because there's a lot of injustice that happened, right? And it's our job to recognize those and to help make it right, you know. um, I know some stuff you can't repair, it's beyond repair, but it's like we need, at a minimum, we need to acknowledge what happened and put an attempt in place, real attempts to make it right for the people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I remember a story, and I'm sure we've all had these experiences where we've been asked or told, go back to where you came from, or, where are you from? Because people assume that we dress this way, or, especially, if you're in a wheelchair or something, you're facing double, triple whammies, you're a person of
It's
color.
true.
They make assumptions that we don't belong here. When I hear stories from our Indigenous sisters and brothers about being made to feel that they don't belong here, it
It
breaks
hurts.
my heart.
It
It's like
hurts.
I feel this deep, deep, deep sorrow that I don't know how to resolve. And I mean, a story that comes to mind to me is a young man spoke. I served as a human rights commissioner in Ontario, and that's where we had some opportunities to learn directly from First Nations folks. And I met um, a young man who talked about his mother moving him into a city off reserve because she wanted him to go to school. And when he went to school, the boys on the playground were saying to him, "Where are you from?" And he was like, "Here." And they said, "No, no, no. Where are you really from?" And he said, "Here." And they said to him again, "Where are your parents from?" "Here." "Your grandparents?" "Here." They said, "No, they're not." He said, "I'm Canadian." And they were like, "No, you're not." And then
Yep.
he finally said, "I'm Indian." And they said to him, "No, you're not. We're Indian." So even colonialism applied language
Yeah.
to our Indigenous people that they have, sometimes felt compelled to use in order to help people understand who they are. And yet they're not Indian. That is true. So this child was so confused and went home to his mother and said, "Who am I?" And I can't imagine my kids being forced to do that. Like, we're mothers, we have children, and our children are born here. They don't belong anywhere else. It would pain us for them to hear, where are they from? And for someone
Yeah.
not to accept that they're
Yeah.
from here.
For that question, Rabia, like early on, I used to give all the spiel, like where I'm from, and I answer all the questions that I get. Then later in life, again, I got tired. I don't want to go through the whole thing again. So then when they ask me, where are you from? I say from Mississauga, and they look at me again, like, what am I talking about? Like, where
Yeah.
exactly? Like, we mean where from? I say Medvale. It's north. It's like by, so and so intersection, right? And I blew their mind because it's, yeah. It's sad. Like, I know it's sad, and I know I'm trying to make the humor out of it, just to keep it on the light side, because the situation is really,
Yeah.
it's really sad.
Rafia,
I
did you face
remember.
that question?
Well, all the time. But this is I remember the very very first time I experienced racism in Canada. It was at the Eaton Center, and I just came here about a couple of days, yeah, a couple of weeks, I think, yeah. And we were going to the Eaton Center, and we were there, and then someone looked at me, and they said, "Paki." Oh my
Yeah.
God. And it's like,
Yeah,
and they were looking at me, so I know it's me. And all I experienced was this sound, and it's like echoing, echoing, echoing.
yeah,
And they said it with such hatred and such, like, really, really hurtful and very nasty way. And I'm like, all I could hear is this echoing, echoing sound. And I'm like, becoming so tiny, 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 and this sound is becoming so big, and this person it was such a, oh my God, it was such a humiliating experience.
yeah,
And I've
Yeah, I had
never.
that when I was a kid, going to public school on the playground, kids calling me Paki all the time, and me feeling like, you know, in Urdu or Punjabi, it's not a dirty word, it's a good word. And yet they were applying it in this, derogatory way. And I came home, feeling like I don't belong here. I cried feeling that I don't belong here. And yet I don't know where else I belong. I face that in my
Raf,
neighborhood as
Rafia,
well.
do you want to laugh? I was called that, and I didn't know it mean a bad thing. I did not know it's a racist thing, so I didn't react, right? And it took me forever until I realized that, oh, this is like this is that, right? So it's like
Yeah, and you're
the
Lebanese.
irony, right? Like, you could call things and you're supposed to have a reaction, but I did not have a reaction because I didn't understand what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Another story I have, one little girl, small story actually. She's born here, right? Like our kids, right? And they ask her, sometimes they tell her, go back where you came from. She said, I'm going to go to Credit Valley Hospital because that's the Credit Valley hospital. That's when she was born, right? She said, I came through Credit Valley, so I guess I got to go back through that, right?
my best one was I just graduated university and decided to wear a hijab. And I went to a conference of educators around, special education, as they call it. I hate that term special, but and I went with somebody from the university who used to do accessible technology. And, she was a tall European background white woman, and there was me. And we were going through this trade show with assistive devices and educational literature and things like that. And there was this woman with an American accent, I could clearly tell. And she says to me, "So where are you from?" And I said innocently, because this was in Waterloo, I said, "I'm from Mississauga." And there was this pause. And I don't do well with pauses. I have to fill pauses. So I said,
That's true.
"Where do you think I'm from?" And she said, "Oh, I thought you were from Iran or Saudi Arabia or something." And I was floored. And then my friend afterwards laughed. She's like, "You should have seen the look on her face when you said Mississauga." Just outside of Toronto. So language really matters, and exclusion can happen so easily. The lack of belonging can happen so easily, and it really leaves a huge impact on us. And we have 150 years of stories to tell around it, given our lived experience. So, on that note, ladies, any closing comments?
We can you imagine a world where Indigenous people, Black people, marginalized people, and people with disabilities are free from this oppression and this carceral
Yeah.
systems? And there's so many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are missing, who are in prison. Like, there's so much that has to be done. And there's over one there's I think 94 calls to action
Yeah.
from the Indigenous community, and we are in solidarity with our community, with the Indigenous community, and support them in freeing themselves and from this oppression.
Yeah, I think we should continue, like, we should continue these talks. We should continue voicing our what we think and what we feel, and we should really be continuing, and we should be in solidarity to get justice, like, and to remove the injustice, and to
Mhm.
acknowledge any injustice that happened to anybody. We're all human. We're all deserve to live a decent, dignified life, and we need to make sure it happens.
Yeah. So we will continue this conversation with more headlines and reflections and lived experience. Tune in to the next episode of The Pity Party. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.